very happy to support it.
Catherine Delahunty.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Tēnā koutou te whare. The Green Party is really happy to be supporting this bill. Just read Keith Locke's second reading speech in 2008, which shows you how long ago it was that this bill was first brought into this House. And I don't see it as a minor piece of legislation. I think it's actually quite significant and plays an important part in the international body of jurisprudence around dealing with an issue that is by no means going away. It's a big international issue, it's an important issue, and this is a very, very good bill. Obviously, the ability to stop the theft and trade of the spoils of war is complicated, but at least we're starting with something coherent for our own country, and that is a very good thing. We're laying out clearly what it is that we can do to be part of the positive commitment to the Hague Convention, which is also a very positive thing. Interestingly enough, in Keith Locke's speech, he talks about the way in which the spoils of war is not something that happens at random, but is actually often part of the deliberate destruction of significant cultural property of people in order to have a huge effect on the national psyche. And I think that is a really important point when we're considering the importance of this bill, because if you look at the national psyche of Iraq or Middle East and what's happened to much of their taonga and how significant that has been, and how those many artefacts are being hocked off around the world by people, it's important to criminalise this because of that effect. Not only the loss of those taonga to those nations, but also the psychological effect of nations who've been subjected to war losing their taonga. And I guess we're keen to also bring it back home. I agree with the Honourable Marion Street's comments about moko mokai, but also if you look at the history of this country, the spoils of war have been very much part of the history of this country, and in a way that we would no longer countenance. But it's good to remember that the spoils of war have been women, the spoils of war have been taonga, all of those things have been used to destroy the psyche of nations and should be criminalised, as well as the taking of life. And it's not good enough to say that bad things happen in war, which is why I support this bill, because it's saying no, we can be accountable, we can track what goes on, and we can prosecute people who are perpetuating these illegal and immoral acts. If, for example, we take this experience of Bell Block and Taranaki, the archaeologists there found, when they carried out the extensive works in Taranaki, they found that the original ancient marae there in Bell Block had been destroyed by the British occupying forces as part of the spoils of war, if you like, by their literally building their camp on top of the ancient power site at Bell Block. And that did huge damage to what could have been a fantastic taonga for the local people, and also towards the history of this country. So those things cannot happen so easily today. We have the Historic Places Trust, but it's still an interesting thing to consider the spoils of war in our own context when considering this bill, which has a strong international focus. If we consider the wharenui that's in Te Papa, Te Hau ki Turanga, Te Hau ki Turanga, the Ronga Whakaata wharenui was a spoil of war, and if you look at the settlement that came before this House not long ago, that was part of acknowledging that. And that's very important for us, and taking the moral high ground, as we should in this bill. It's very important to acknowledge that the spoils of war have had a huge psychic effect on tangata whenua and on the nations of this country and our own history of colonisation. So it is excellent that we move forward on all these fronts in terms of the idea that these iconic buildings, in some cases, taonga and others, are acknowledged as being essential to the peace and well-being of nations, to their identity and psyche, and to the rule of law. So the Green Party is very pleased to be supporting this bill. We're very aware that there's a lot to be done internationally to make it happen, and that it's very, very complex. We're aware that the problem affects many nations other than our own, but at least we're making a start in saying, what can we do in this country? And we're not limiting it just to soldiers. The flowchart that was referred to also uncovers perhaps mercenaries, perhaps people involved in war, and they can also be found to be criminals if they participate in this destruction. This destruction has affected many, many peoples all around the world, including the Sri Lankan people, the Tamils, when they lost the Jaffna the library that was burnt in the 1980s. And a library is more than just a building, it is a repository of culture. And so it's very much, this bill is very much acknowledging that culture is broad, culture is deep, and culture is people's identity. And if we steal it and destroy it as conquerors, then we need to be held to account. And so it's going to be interesting to see how various military actions of the 21st century are viewed in terms of the spoils of war and in terms of how we're going to hold them to account. But this bill is very timely. We need to follow up on our obligations, and we have signed meaningful protocols. We need to make sure that we make this real. And I think a lot of work was done at the Select Committee, which I was not part of, in 2008. Now at last we're coming to the point where we're saying we can sign it off. I don't think anyone in this House would be in disagreement, because it's not always clear whether we'll be able to cover every theft that takes place in war, but I think it's clear that we will do our best. The Green Party is very interested in history and in our own history and our own accountability. Also the issue of Moko Mokai, which was raised, which is ongoing. I can think of a mountain, Kikitangio in Taitokoro, where a Austrian so-called explorer stole, his name was Andres Radchik, he stole some taonga from Urupa, which are still in Europe. And so there's still a lot of work to be done around this. And if this bill, I'm not sure whether it applies directly to Moko Mokai. Those initiatives are ongoing. But there's a lot of unfinished business around this issue on the planet. But we are pleased to support this bill because we believe it helps to finish business. It helps to provide legal instruments, hopefully as a deterrent to some of the appalling destruction that's taken place under the name of the rights of the conqueror to take the spoils of war. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Todd McClay.